Hello everyone, welcome back to Rare Japanese Sounds, and today we have a new entry in what is probably my most requested series, and I'm talking of course about A Collector's Guide. And the topic of today's video is going to be one of the most well-known keyboard players of Japan, and most specifically CD pop over the 70s and 80s. And I am talking of course about none other than Hiroshi Sato. Now, what to say about Hiroshi Sato? The first thing I would like to mention is if you have even the slightest bit of knowledge about CD pop but don't know Hiroshi Sato for some reason, well, he played in probably most of the top influential CD pop albums out there. He played in For You, he played in Variety, the album which includes Plastic Love, of course. He also played in After Five Clash, and he was one of the musicians in Seaside Lovers. If you know any of those albums, then you will know the importance of them, because everybody knows them. And yet, it's rarely mentioned that Hiroshi Sato was part of those albums. And even, in terms of popularity back in the day, he never got the same amount of popularity as other artists like Tatsuro Yamashita or Toshiki Kadomatsu. And that's too bad, because his style has evolved in such a way over the decades that there is so much to learn about him, so much to discuss in terms of his discography, and even on collecting, in terms of collecting, there is so much to say, and that's why I decided to make a whole episode about him. Of course, I'm not going to mention every single album that he's worked on, because that would be too much work. It's at least 100, perhaps 200. And I'm not also going to mention very obscure stuff. For this episode, I would like to mention I'd only like to focus on his releases that were released under his own name and not releases on which he was just a musician, even though his contribution might have been important. So, without further ado, let's get into it with Hiroshi Sato's first ever album, which is called Supermarket and was released under the Wave Concept label. It's definitely not one of Hiroshi Sato's most well-known albums, and it's not even his most expensive one by any stretch. But it's still a very important album, especially if you listen to it only knowing Hiroshi Sato's most popular albums like Awakening and This Boy. You will be quite surprised by the style that he had only 10 years prior, this album being from 1976. And you're definitely feeling some of the vibes of groups like Happy End or Tin Pan Alley. You definitely have that folk style at its core, but you also can hear by some moments the typical piano style of composition that he showcases in some of the songs, and that's really how you can most feel Hiroshi Sato's presence in the album. In terms of rarity and price, it's not extremely rare, and the price, at least as of August 2020, is around, let's say, 6,000 yen for something that you would buy on auction in pretty good condition. So as you can see, it's much less expensive than his most expensive albums, and it's an extremely important one in terms of understanding Hiroshi Sato's discography from the beginning up till the end. And if we move on to his second album, also released on the Wave Concept label, which is called Just Time in one word, you get the same bass principle, a lot of folk, but you get a bit more instrumental, and you start getting a bit away from merely acoustic instruments, and you start getting a bit of more digital sounds, and you will understand why I'm saying that as we get further along his discography. But both of those albums have the same core in terms of general rarity and maybe price, although time is a bit more expensive and a bit harder to find. You will have to spend around 12,000 yen to get a nice copy as of today. And I think that the reason is because you start getting a bit more complex in terms of melodies. The instrumentals, I think, are better in time. You can see how he developed his style in this second album. Also, it's worth mentioning that Hiroshi Sato also released an EP, a single, for his first album, although it's pretty rare, and you can expect to spend about 5,000 yen for it, which is pretty expensive for a single compared to the full album, which is in basically the same price range. Definitely you can feel that those first two albums didn't sell very well, and that might be why first Hiroshi Sato decided to change label from Wave Concept to Key Records, the same label as you can say Love Trip by Takako Mamiya or most of Masayoshi Takanaka's records. So it's a pretty well-known label, and you might have expected to have a bit more coverage and it might sell a bit better for his third album. But if you know very well Hiroshi Sato, you will know that his only album published on the Kiddie record label was Orient. Now, there are a lot of things to say about Orient, which is definitely Hiroshi Sato's, well, you could say masterpiece. Many people would define it as Hiroshi Sato's masterpiece. And why do they say that? Basically, Orient is a couple of songs with vocals. And actually, the single that came out released alongside Orient was featuring only the 2 tracks with vocals on it. But beyond those 2 tracks, all the rest of the album is purely instrumental, and instrumental that really takes a big leap forward from what we saw in Hiroshi Sato's previous albums. Here you can feel a lot more fusion vibes and a bit more psychedelic even. And there is such creativity in the instrumental, it's really different from what we were used to with his first 2 albums. And that's what people refer to as being his masterpiece. And actually, the very unique side that you can feel throughout Orient, you can find some fragments of it in Hiroshi Sato's later albums, even in Awakening and all the way to even his very, very final albums, even in the 2000s. So that's really what so many people say is the cornerstone of Hiroshi Sato's style. But if you know him only for Awakening and This Boy, you might notice that the style is completely different. So what happened between Orient, which by the way now is fetching above 20 to 30,000 even for excellent copies, and for a reason, it's extremely rare to find. You might only get 1 listing per year on Yahoo Auctions, which is extremely low. You might get hundreds of listings for, let's say, For You by Tatsuro Yamashita, but only maybe 1 per year for Orient, which just tells you to which extent like the rarity of the album is compared to most popular city pop albums. This one is really among the rarest you can find. So what happened between Orient and Hiroshi Sato's next album, which is Awakening, of course? Well, in the meantime, Hiroshi Sato moved to the US, and there he played a number of, did a number of gigs with various musicians, which I can't remember the name of, but it really probably changed his perspective on what kind of career he wanted to have. And by the time he came back to Japan, he signed with Alpha Records, the same label as Cassiopeia and many other artists. So again, a pretty big label. And there you can see definitely a shift in what kind of production Hiroshi Sato got for his albums. And you got basically a shift from albums in which he had probably a lot of creative freedom, like the freedom to do whatever he wanted. But once you get to Awakening, you get to something that is much more mainstream and much more adapted to a wide audience. And even though Awakening is still fetching between 12 to 15,000 yen for good copies, it's much easier to find than Orient. And you can say that he started to actually get some sales for his albums. Of course, it's nowhere near the level as, tier 1 pop artists at the time, but it's still better than he had for Orient and his previous albums. So the style definitely is different. It's much more accessible, much more mainstream, but you still get some pieces here and there of what his style used to be with Orient. And I think that's something I'm glad his label let him do, because it does give a bit of personality rather than just going song after song. Because, Awakening is not particularly daring in any way. It's mostly basic city pop. Like, it's really considered one of the core albums of city pop because of how simple it is, how simple the themes are throughout the album. Just, love, breakup, and finding one another again. So it's nothing super fancy out there. It's just one good city pop albums. And it shows, like, the style is very polished. A lot of good musicians are playing alongside Hiroshi Sato in the album, and a lot of those musicians will accompany him throughout his career even. So that's how you get really the basis of Hiroshi Sato's new debut, as they would say in Japanese. And all of his albums after that will have that trace of Awakening and are much closer to Awakening musically than to his previous albums. It's worth mentioning that Awakening also came with a promotional single, a 7-inch, that was probably only given to record stores or radio stations or that kind of things. And that single features on the A-side, I Can't Wait, which is probably the most well-known song by Hiroshi Sato by today's standards. Anyway, that single is pretty rare and easily fetches over 10,000 yen on Yahoo Auctions when it pops up, which is, pretty rare given the promotional nature of the single. And if we move on to 1983, we get to the next release in which Hiroshi Sato participated in a major way. But it wasn't a solo album, because I am of course talking about Seaside Lovers. Now, Seaside Lovers, I probably shouldn't mention it among Hiroshi Sato's solo albums, but because he was one of the main composers, and because it's such a well-known album, I thought I should give a word or two about it. So Seaside Lovers was part of the Sound Image series by the Sony CBS label. And basically the goal of the Sound Image series was to create instrumental albums that would give some sort of tropical vibe for most, except for some of them, but at least 3 or 4 out of the 5 or 6, it depends how many you think they are in the Sound Image series, but that is a whole other debate. But most of the albums have some kind of vibe that reflects on summer or the sea in some way. And Seaside Lovers is no exception, and is generally argued to be the top album among the series, probably competing with The Pacific, of course, which was the first album in the series, and Seaside Lovers being the last one. Anyway, so Seaside Lovers is almost full instrumental with some vocals here and there, and some of the tracks have been composed by Hiroshi Sato and played by him, of course. And because of the whole aesthetic around the album, because of the quality of the tracks, that's why you see Seaside Lovers fetching above 10,000 yen easily. Even though the album itself isn't that rare, it's a bit around the same rarity as Awakening, but you still are around that price range. And one of the things I really like about Seaside Lovers is the huge poster that comes with the album. Really, really nice one. Moving on to 1984, we get an album that honestly I don't think Hiroshi Sato had much to do with, but for the sake of completionism, I'm just going to mention it. It's called Winning History, and it's basically a mix of field recordings of bikes and a few Hiroshi Sato songs. I don't really know much about the album. It's not very expensive. Don't pay too much for it, but if you are a big Hiroshi Sato fan, it's a cool novelty item. You get also a big poster, which I'm a big fan of. More importantly, in 1984, we get Sailing Blaster, which is the second album by Hiroshi Sato under the Alpha label. Now, Sailing Blaster is definitely not one of Hiroshi Sato's most popular or even most expensive albums. I would say it's one of the cheapest records by Hiroshi Sato on vinyl record. And that is even despite the fact that it contains probably what was Hiroshi Sato's quote-unquote hit at the time, and that is of course Sweet Inspiration. You get the original mix for Sweet Inspiration, but you also get a few songs by the Beatles, which you might have noticed from Awakening, and which you will notice also in a few of his later albums. And I found it kind of funny that he did so many Beatles cover, just like Tatsuro Yamashita did a Beach Boys cover all the way from his first albums to Big Wave and so on. But anyway, I'm getting off topic here. And the fact is that Sailing Blaster is a pretty good album, and it's sold, I think, a bit better than Awakening, but it's definitely much less popular, and you can get it for around 3,000 yen, depending on condition, presence or absence of the obi, and so on. But it's still a pretty good album. It's definitely worth having in your Hiroshi Sato collection. There was also a 7-inch that came out alongside Sailing Blaster, and which is Sun Glow. That EP is honestly pretty cheap, and same thing goes for almost every 7-inch by Hiroshi Sato past that point. So it's a great entry into your collection if you want to get a few vinyl records by him without, going too deep, reaching too deep inside your pockets. And now we get to 1985, which is the year in which This Boy was released. And of course, This Boy is probably the album that started we could call it the reminiscence of Hiroshi Sato, his resurgence among city pop celebrities in the 2010s and beyond. So why this boy in particular? Honestly, I have no idea, but it's probably a mix between the aesthetics of the jacket, you know, the cover having a guy swimming. And by the way, for those who don't know, the origin of that jacket of someone swimming is because most of the songs in This Boy were actually used as part of commercials, and one of the brands that used those songs as commercials was Kosugi. Kosugi, I don't remember the name of the company. I think it was Kosugi, which like rebranded swimwear by Jensen, and basically those commercials would be people with like blonde hair and very 80s in the style. I definitely recommend you check it out. You will probably find it in the corner of the video if I linked it to you. But yeah, you basically get those four very 80s style ads of people doing lots of things in Jensen swimwear and sportswear. So that's where the idea behind This Boy came, and why you get that kind of aesthetics towards the album and the cover. Anyway, you get all those songs by Hiroshi Sato put together in such a, well, in a perfect way, you could say. Like, they go together so well that you would think it was a whole original album. And you get the best. You get I Can't Wait, you get, of course, Say Goodbye, you get Sweet Inspiration right at the beginning, you get Shiny Lady. You get so many great songs put together that I definitely understand the price behind the album, even though, for instance, Sailing Blaster, which had Sweet Inspiration, is so much cheaper. So yeah, it's an amazing album. It's probably not going to be reissued very easily because it's a compilation. It doesn't make as much sense nowadays to re-release a compilation, just like Magical, you know. Anyway, the price for this album is a bit like Awakening, in the 10 to 15,000 yen, but it's pretty easy to find it in great condition for some reason. I see a lot of copies in great shape, which is great as a collector. It means you have more choice and prices are a bit down as a result. Anyway, in 1985, Hiroshi Sato also released a 12-inch single called Love Me Do. This one is extremely cheap, and I don't really know why. Probably because Love Me Do is a song by the Beatles. If you care about the Beatles, you will listen to the Beatles and not cover songs by Hiroshi Sato. But it's a great addition to one's collection, and it only costs around 1,000 to 2,000 yen. So a great pickup if you are on a spree of buying things and you are on limited budgets. I think it's a great buy. So This Boy is probably what is the last well-known album by Hiroshi Sato, and when you start moving further and further into the 1980s and 90s and the 2000s, Hiroshi Sato's albums were just not as well-known as before. And it's too bad, because I think his style really started to become solidified into something very unique and very pleasant to listen to. But once you get to 1986 and Sound of Science, you do still keep the same idea that there was in This Boy, in Sailing Blaster, and etc. But, just not the same popularity for some reason. I think it might pick up somewhere down the line when people start enjoying Hiroshi Sato as an artist and not just enjoying This Boy and Awakening. But to each their own, and you can pick it up at least for 2,500 yen or something along those lines. It's extremely cheap for the great content that you get, musically speaking. And let me remind everyone that none of Hiroshi Sato's albums sold very well, so all of those albums are pretty rare by records standard. But yeah, not much else to say about Sound of Science. And in 1987 you get Future File, which I think I read somewhere is actually Hiroshi Sato's best-selling album ever, which is pretty ironic given how many great albums he did and how Future File is honestly pretty good, I would say. You get a lot of interesting things, and my favorite track is definitely the last one, which is like an 8 minutes completely crazy club mix of Sweet Inspiration. I definitely recommend that you give it a listen because it's completely crazy, and I think it will have a lot of success even in today's nightclubs. But yeah, this is his best-selling album, but it's definitely not that common to find in record shops or anywhere. And again, you can find it in that price range of 2,500 yen to maybe 4,000 if you're pushing it a little. But it's a great album. I prefer it to Sound of Science in many ways. But now we get to 1988 and what is probably one of my favorite albums by Hiroshi Sato. It's not that well known, but it's definitely extremely rare in terms of pure number of records sold. It's clearly less than Futurefy, clearly less than Sound of Science, This Boy, Awakening, and this one I'm talking about is Aqua. Now, Aqua is basically, I think, the best of Hiroshi Sato's style. You get some amazing instrumentals, including some covers of other jazz musicians. You also get extremely good, just good pop songs when you get to the tail end of city pop, and when you start, merging city pop into regular pop. And I'm referring to songs like Sit for Two and I think Picnic. I'm not sure about the title, but anyway, those two tracks, Sit for Two and Picnic, can be found in a single because Aqua fetches easily over 10,000 yen if you want to have it in good condition. But the single, the 7-inch with the Sit for Two and Picnic, it can be found for much less than that, so there you have it. In 1988, Hiroshi Sato also released another compilation, so like This Boy, but with his later albums from Sound of Science to Aqua. Don't remember exactly if there is much more than that, but you also get a few of his earlier successes. I think you also have another version of Sweet Inspiration. You can definitely feel that it was his main hit at the time because Alpha wanted to put Sweet Inspiration into every single release by Hiroshi Sato. But anyway, so this second compilation, definitely rarer than This Boy. And also I should mention that all of those albums from Selling Blaster all the way to the present were released on LP, of course, but also CD and cassettes. And of course the CD is much less rare than the LP version, except for This Boy maybe, where the CD is actually pretty expensive, but for all the other albums it's pretty cheap compared to the LP version. I know that there are a lot of CD collectors, so that's a great opportunity to build a collection. Now, cassette releases, it's much harder to find, and it's the case for every cassette out there, so don't blame yourself if you can't find any cassette release by Hiroshi Sato. It's just extremely rare. Anyway, so this second compilation sold, not very well, but still you get a lot of tracks by Hiroshi Sato, and it's not that expensive. You get a lot of variants due to the album not being very popular. So the more popular an album is and the more stable the price is. So in that case, you can have the opportunity to wait for great deals. One factor that perhaps went into the popularity of Aqua, at least nowadays, is the fact that it was Hiroshi Sato's last album to be released on vinyl. And his next album from 1989, Touch the Heart, was only released as a CD and as a cassette, of course. Although there was a 7-inch record that was released, and it featured, I think, Stop the Rain and Fuzzy Love. And it's a great pickup because the single is only around 3,000 yen, around that ballpark. It's pretty hard to give a precise price because of how volatile things are. But it's a great pickup, honestly, if you like Hiroshi Sato's later albums. And Touch the Heart, I think, is one of his best. Honestly, from Aqua all the way to All of Me, I think Hiroshi Sato made some of his best albums of all time, and they are completely ignored today. I think it's really too bad, but yeah, Touch the Heart is an amazing album. The first 4 tracks are all amazing, and I definitely recommend that you give it a listen if you can. Anyway, I'm going to go a bit more quickly over his next albums because they were only released as CDs and nobody knows about them anyway. So next up you have another compilation, which is Snowland. And it features some of Hiroshi Sato's later releases from Touch the Heart, among others. It's not really well known, but you do get a 7-inch record again, and that will be the last 7-inch record by Hiroshi Sato. The rest will be on 8cm single 8cm CDs or something. Nobody cares about those anyway. But from Snowland after that you get Good Morning. And by the way, all those albums I'm quoting, like Touch the Heart, Snowland, Good Morning, those are all 1,000 yen albums. Extremely easy to find, even in great condition with the OB. They are dirt cheap. I would always recommend them for you to buy them, just to have the complete discography of Hiroshi Sato. Anyway, once we get past 1990, Hiroshi Sato kept releasing albums all the way until his death in 2012. And those albums are so still unknown even today that I don't think many people here will be interested in hearing everything about them. So I'm just going to mention what I think are the most important ones. And I would like to start with All of Me, released in 1994, only as CD as far as I know. This album is honestly, I think, the best modern quote-unquote album by Hiroshi Sato, just because of how good the music is. I was extremely surprised the first time I heard it. I wasn't expecting much because I never heard about it before, and the first time I just got the CD and plugged it into my record player, I was stunned by just how good the music was and the fact that nobody knew about it. So that's why it's my honestly top recommendation. It's also worth noting that there are a lot of compilations among the albums Hiroshi Sato released over the years, and one of them is particularly expensive. It's called Creamy Aqua, and its cover is easily recognizable because it's very colorful compared to what you will usually see from Hiroshi Sato, but it's very expensive. I think it usually sells for about 5,000 yen, much more than his other albums around the same era. And other similar albums that were released really at the very end of Hiroshi Sato's career, like Amazing 2, those albums I haven't listened to all of them just because of the CD being very hard to get and pretty expensive. But those albums do fetch a high price point. I wouldn't be surprised if ever Hiroshi Sato got a very solid following of people very dedicated to collecting all of his works, that those CDs might get more expensive as time goes on. But anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this very cursory glance at Hiroshi Sato's career. I apologize for those of you who expected something as complete as I did for Hiroshi Yoshimura. And actually, because we are at the end of the video and nobody is watching anyway, I just would like to mention that the Hiroshi Yoshimura guide was pretty incomplete, and there are a lot of things I would love to mention that I just learned from getting more material on him, and probably at some point I will make a more complete guide on Hiroshi Yoshimura, but that would require a lot more work, and I would like to do something more complete, and I don't really have the time for that. But I still hope that you enjoyed this quick tour of Hiroshi Sato's albums. I hope you learned a thing or two, and let me know if you would like this format to change in any way. I always enjoy getting your feedback, even if it's negative. All feedback is good to me. Anyway, this was Where Japanese Sounds. I hope you've enjoyed the content, and until next time, stay tuned.